All right, welcome everybody. It is our another first Thursday night free community webinar through Studio Petrichor and Pollyanna, our nonprofit. Thank you all for being here and sharing where you have signed in from. And yeah, thanks for being here. Just a few notes about this evening. Please keep yourself on mute. We are recording. This video will be up on YouTube. Lisa will let us know how long she would prefer us to keep it up. You know, typically it's up for a month and then it goes down, but that'll be up to her. And so Pollyanna, so Studio Petrichor is a landscape architecture design firm. Our focus is on regenerative whole systems approach to design implementation, as well as ongoing land care support. And we are so interested in educating and empowering communities to honor and protect natural living systems that we were inspired a few years back to start a nonprofit. And so the nonprofit is focused on education and hopefully research someday. And we have a lot of upcoming, great upcoming events, which I'm going to put into the chat box, but I'm going to go over them really quickly with you. And there's going to be some more information on how to sign up for our newsletter. Follow us on Studio Petrichor, and I am messing around on TikTok, having fun with making some videos, and some information on how to contact Lisa if you need to do that. So our upcoming events is always on our website. The link will be in there. We are excited to announce our upcoming hugelkultur workshops, retitled Carbon Culture, and we have a Hugelist certification program, and there are spaces available. Two spots left for June 3rd. I'm sorry, 2 dates left because May 20th or May 13th is sold out. May 20th and June 3rd in Pasadena. The next webinar next first Thursday is Chris Cosma from UC Riverside, and he's going to present on native plants for butterfly and moth conservation. And the tool he created that aligns with calscape.org is phenomenal. And we will be presenting with the Landscape Expo, designing whole systems gardens, cleaning that presentation up. Phenomenal Landscapes is coming back again for part 2. And we're so excited to announce we're doing another midsummer garden tour up here in Altadena, Pasadena, and La Cañada, reimagining gardens. And there are spaces available for that. It sells out quickly. And we serve you lunch at the end, which is a lot of fun. And I'm going to go deep on August 3rd. I'm going to be redefining egocentric design with you on the August 3rd free community webinar. So check it out. And I'm going to put this in the chat box. And I would like to gratefully, lovingly introduce Lisa Smith, who has been such a wonderful mentor and teacher for me over the years, as I've been growing from a little baby to the little playful boy that I still am today. And so Lisa Smith, thank you so much for being here tonight. And the floor or the screen is yours.
Okay, I guess I'm going to share a screen here. Everybody buckle up. I got a lot to share here. And let me make sure I've got the screen. Give me a thumbs up if you can see my whole screen here. Hold on a second. Okay, I want to make sure. Okay, you can probably see the side. Sorry about that, but it is what it is. I like to, hold on a second. I'm trying to make it wider. Okay, so it's a potpourri tonight, but I thought, last year, all I talked about was the drought. We're in the mega drought. Oh my gosh, there's the drought going on. Has anybody heard about the drought? And I got tired of talking about a drought for a decade, since 2011. And if you didn't realize, last year, 2022, it was like reaching epic proportions. And then lo and behold, we get the monster winter rainfall, par none for 40 years. So I guess I should stop talking about droughts, right? No, we're not going to do that. We're going to still talk about droughts, but we're going to talk about it from the context of all this rain we've received, the winds, the heat, the extremes that our trees are still going to experience. So I'm going to give you a quick overview. Tree management means root management, Your roots are where it all starts. We're going to talk basic biology, ways we damage bark, your takeaways, disease triangle, how do diseases get started, tree hazards. I'm going to calibrate your eyes with defects. We're going to look at lots of defects because let me tell you, this year is going to be the year by the end of 2023, a lot of branches are going to be breaking. Newsflash, you heard it here. All these trees are going to be plumped up and they're going to over flush out and they're going to be heavy. Okay. So we'll look at tree hazards and defects, species failure profiles. What does that mean? Every species has a failure profile. Risk mitigation pruning strategies, strategic pruning, salt toxicity, climate change, and mulch and adapted species. And I'm going to get into some amazing new data about trees of California. Okay, so let's jam through this. And this is going to be recorded, so you can go back later. Okay, I just open source all this stuff. Tree management means root management. Keep those roots happy, right? Incompatible trees and understory plants and turf. Irrigation, trees like it deep. Infrequent, plants like it frequent and shallow, right? Doesn't really jive. When the weather is cool and the climate isn't too stressful, that incompatibility is not so much an issue. But when it gets hot and extreme, that's when trees are going to show problems. Pruning, proper tree management can improve root management. And I'm going to talk about that later. Species, right tree, right place. Diseases, how root diseases can be minimized by using mulch. And we're going to talk about the benefits and the beauty of mulch. And the beginning of healthy trees, tolerating extremes, reducing root-borne, soil-borne pathogens, reducing your water use, imagine that, and regulating the soil temperatures all starts with mulch, my favorite thing, okay? And if any of you were in my class, you know that my class I teach at UCLA, you know how much I love mulch. Okay, where can problems occur on trees in the urban forest? Now, a root zone is a root plate, right? Roots don't typically go 3, 4, 5 feet down. They are going to anchor out like a root plate. So roots stay in the top about 12 to 24 inches where there's water, nutrients, and most importantly, oxygen. The tree's anchoring itself, okay? This root zone is important. Under the canopy, you might call the tree protection zone, even closer, maybe the critical root zone. And these have a combination of all different types of roots. You have lateral roots, sinker roots, fine absorbing roots, oblique heart root roots, and the taproot. The taproot is a short-lived root, so don't think that the tree is anchored by its taproot. Anchoring roots are going to be your lateral. They're going to be going out, maybe a little bit of oblique too. You have different tree shapes. So learn your tree shapes, how the structure of a particular tree is growing, and how you can prune to reduce branch failure, reduce wind loading with these extreme winds that we're experiencing, and increase the health and vigor of the trees. Okay, so let's take a moment. And I know I'm going fast, but we're already under the gun. Sean's nodding like, good job, Lise, keep it going. Indy 500, here we go around the block. Bark. The bark is very important. And just to give you a quick primer, remember you have your bark, you have your outer bark, you have phloem, and then you have the cambial layer, which is a cell, you have xylem, and then heartwood. Now the bark is like a skin. It protects the tree from sunlight, bugs, pests, insects, diseases, oak root fungus, protects that tree, and from extreme weather. Another thing that the bark does is it exchanges gases, okay? Now looking at this chart, the phloem is, if you remember, phloem is all the good photosynthetic material coming down from the leaves into the roots. So I say flow, go below. And the xylem is where the water and nutrients are going up. And that's where the tree is putting on extra wood, that xylem tissue. And xylem tissue is also where the majority of load for that tree, like an empty Coke can, if you're standing on that empty Coke can, all the load is distributed to the outer xylem. So load for trees is concentrated on the outer perimeter, okay? So xy to the sky, water and nutrients, flow go below. Remember, bugs love the phloem, sap feeders, okay? We'll get into that. So now you've had a crash course on the vascular tissue. Remember, the cambium is part of the vascular tissue where water and nutrients enter the tree from the roots. Sugars and starches are produced in the leaves and sent to the roots, but it's an area of trees where insects can invade. And as I mentioned, on the bark, it has an area where gases are exchanging. It's called the lenticels. They're little soft, spongy portions of the bark. And what they're doing is actively exchanging gases. Now, when the tree gets older, it slows down. And what slows down too is that they become less efficient. And when you have a trunk that's buried at the base, those lenticels have a compromise. They're trying to exchange gases, but they also let pathogens in. So right at that trunk flare root plate interface is right at that dynamic area where pathogens can get in to a tree and get into that area behind the bark and start to eat away like oak root fungus. So what are ways that we damage trees? Chronic moisture, chronic, always hitting the trunk, encourages pathogens, allows working of lenticels to be compromised. It reduces the exchange of gases. Overall, it's just stressing out the tree, reduces health and vigor, reduces the integrity of the buttress roots, and reduces vascular system, meaning the canopy looks a little peaked, looks like it's having dieback, the leaves look off color. We're going to talk about what signs might you see, okay? Here's an example, chronic moisture. Here's San Vicente by my house. These coral trees, and if you really look, you notice it was already a rainy day and the irrigation is on anyway, because we want to make sure that the trunks get cleaned and washed off. I'm being facetious here. And then chronic moisture collecting in these crotches of all these trunks causes a blooming onion. And if you look closely, you can see that is completely rotted out. The joint where all of those trunks meet is a poor, weak union, and moisture collects in there, and it's anaerobic. So it becomes a perfect breeding ground, okay? So think of that when you have irrigation set up to water other plant material near trees. Plant material at the base of a tree, overwatering, such cute little snapdragons, and voila, oak root fungus. It's a chronic problem all the time. Sean wants to use that for his hugel material. Here's another example, Brazilian pepper, chronically prone to oak root fungus. You see the turf over here, spraying on the trunk all the time, all this white mycelial spores that you see from the oak root fungus, armillaria pathogen. If you look really closely here on the right, you see the shoestring armillaria developing here. The tree dropped all its leaves in literally one weekend in the summertime, because that oak root fungus is eating under the bark, eating away all of that uptake of material, water and nutrients. You have a hot day, no ability to pull up water, the leaves dry out and they die instantaneously. So when you have that quick decline and death in the middle of summer, it's typically root rot, because the trees are not able to handle the heat. They can't pull up water, okay? So what is effective irrigation? Spray it away from the trunk, point it away, use a soaker hose, use a drip system, use bubblers, whatever it is keep the trunk dry, okay? Now, if you have something turning on once a month, I'm not gonna kill you. I'm just gonna say, you know what? It's like a rainfall. It's like a summer rain, okay? But keep your trunks dry. Prune, and I'm kind of leaping ahead a little bit. Pruning for load management, protect your roots with mulch, and unbury the trunks and keep mulch off the trunks, keep the trunks protected. So when you're looking at trees for risk, you're going to observe the structure, prune for load, reduce soil and root pathogens, and that will help to improve longevity. Kind of jumping around here a little bit. Let's talk about tree diseases. So the tree disease triangle is what you need to remember, is that you have three components. You have the host, which is your tree. You have the pathogen over here, and then you have the environment. So you have a tree, you have an oak, you have oak root fungus. That doesn't mean that oak is ever going to get oak root fungus. It needs the third component of cultural conditions, an environment, something that is going to connect those three and now let that pathogen into the host. If you can suppress and take care of the environment, you can help to reduce the likelihood of disease. So let's talk about that. How to reduce potential for diseases. The easiest way is to create optimal or improved growing conditions. That's the easiest thing. That's what you have control over. We have the tree, we love the tree. We know the diseases are there. We know everybody, there's a cold, there's the flu, it's out there. What can we do to minimize the chance that that tree gets the cold or the flu? So keep the trunks dry, unbury the trunk. Oh, it got a weird echo. Sean.
You're good. I had to mute somebody. You're good.
Okay, sorry. Okay.
All good.
And root collar excavation, I'm going to show you some examples of those, and then back to mulch. And we're going to talk about that. Okay. So really, the more you create an optimal growing condition for that trunk flare and the roots, the more you will suppress and reduce pathogens. The canopy is just a reflection. Okay. So what are some of the most common diseases that we have here in Southern California? And oak root fungus or honey fungus, Armillaria malea, is very common. There's hundreds of species that are prone to it, even though it's called oak root fungus. I mean, we know lots and lots of trees that can get this. It is not sudden oak death, which is in Northern California. Sudden oak death needs a certain climate to take advantage of oak trees. Okay, so not that, it's different. We also have Phytophthora cinnamomi, which is a soil-borne pathogen, and it causes bleeding cankers on trunks. You may have seen a lot of this over the last year because Phytophthora likes stressed trees, and it's a soil-borne pathogen, but it can be encouraged by chronic water or drought. It's like people are so confused, like, wait a minute, I thought Phytophthora was waterborne. Yes, but it also can attack trees that are drought stressed. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Let me give you a highlight of it, is that the salt in our soils last year was off the charts. And those of you that were in my class, you know how I talk about salts in the soils. And what salt does is it pulls the moisture out. We cure meat, we put some salt on it, pulls the moisture out. The same thing occurs in the soil when there's high salinity from using just our irrigation, which has trace salt. It leaves behind this superficial layer of high salinity in the soil. It changes the pH balance of the soil. And in doing that, it actually pulls the moisture and the photosynthates, meaning the sap, the sugars, the starches made from the leaves, stored in the roots. We call those photosynthates. It pulls those out. And it actually pulls the pathogens in to the roots. So we call that leaky root syndrome. And the more you know about it, you understand, you think, oh, wow. So that salt buildup over the last decade of not a real robust rainy season just is a chronic stressor on the roots. The roots are constantly like, we're trying to pull up water, but the ionic action with that high salinity is decreasing the uptake of water, decreasing the uptake of nutrients. It repels, and it makes just the tree look like, I call it general malaise. So Phytophthora gets up into the trees. If you see oaks, I'm going to show you some photos with bleeding cankers. And then lastly, we have Latiferous sulfureus, sulfur fungus. Now, this is a different type of rot, and I'm going to show you some photos. And in fact, I forgot to add one more photo in, but I'm gonna find it before we finish today. Sulfur fungus is a heartwood rotter. So you have the trunk and it starts in the center, but diseases and pathogens work in a conical fashion. So like, say they get into the base of the tree through chronic moisture, and then they eat the inside heartwood like a cone. But as they're eating up the heartwood as a cone, they're also consuming the under portion of the root plate. Like you see those blue gum eucalyptus, they pop out of the ground without any warning. And you're like, where are all the roots? Well, that heartwood rotter is very cryptic. You can't see it. There's no outward sign. That's why brown rot is the most dangerous. Very cryptic. You see stone pine, Aleppo pine, all the eucalyptus species, especially blue gum, highly prone to sulfur fungus. Okay, that's why I'm always dubious with blue gums. Okay, so let's calibrate our eyes. Let's get into some fun photos here. Okay, so now we're going to have all this rain. We're going to have all these trees plumped up. What are you going to look for as a layperson? You're a designer, you're in the biz, but you aren't an arborist. That's okay. I want to calibrate your eyes so you can look. First thing you want to do when I see a tree and I'm looking up, first thing I do is I look down at the root flare and I'm checking for any fungal fruiting bodies, any loose bark, any signs or symptoms that the tree should be excavated to further examine the root flare. Because that point, remember, that's where decay gets going. And then we're going to move up to the canopy. We're going to look at the limbs and the branches. And those are really the area for most common failures. Okay. Are there co-dominant branches? This is a common structural defect. And this occurs when the stem divides into two branches and one becomes a competing leader. That can be a very poor attachment. It depends. And that can also include included bark, which is where the bark of the two branches is actually pushing up against each other. And that inclusion becomes a weak point. And I'm going to show you some photos of those. So here would be our checklist. These are obvious defects or signs of potential likelihood of failure. Dead branches in the tree, detached hangers, branches on the ground, or the tree fell down. I was over at Little Holmby Park about a year and a half ago, and there was a group of moms, and they're sitting there with their little toddlers, and there was a huge liquid amber next to them. This is at Little Holmby, and a huge branch on the ground. And it was like August. And I said, you know, I'm a tree risk assessor, and this tree is like locked and loaded to shed some more branches. And I don't want to be like a nervous Nelly, but I think you might want to move from this tree and maybe move. And they just looked at me and laughed like, what does this lady know? You know, they just sat there. I'm like, there's a huge 20-foot branch already on the ground next to the tree, you know. So look at your tree for a history of failures. Loose bark on the trunk, cracks or splits, poor development, it's leaning, it has a bowing effect. You see a cavity in the trunk or rotten wood on major branches like sun scald, and it's rotted and bowed out. Mushrooms at the base, so obvious. Area has been altered, new sidewalk, new driveway, new anything, new curbing, you name it. The tree just looks like general malaise. It's yellow, chlorotic. It may have root rot issues and previous topping, which has resulted in a flush of new growth. Okay, so here's an example of what you might run into. So you have a leaning tree, you've got D as a burl, E is a split branch that might have been torquing from a wind event. C, we have a co-dominant stem. D, dead branches or dead bark, sorry. G is hangers in the tree. F is a hollow stem. So these are just things you might see, right? So you would go through this list here. So here are some photos I've taken over the years. Leaning tree. This photo gives me consternation every time. Okay, well, and the blue gum next to it had fallen over. So leaning blue gum, elevated canopy, very slender taper, not like nice and full and then gets thinner, thinner, thinner. It's leaning away. It has hardscape over the uphill tension side. I mean, you just check off the list of all the defects, right? Here's another one, elongated branch. Now this is a real huge problem where people don't recognize this. I'm trying to annotate this here really fast, is to show you that when you have an elongated branch, very long, and it's also outside of the main canopy, really. This to me is the main canopy right here. That wind that's impacting this area is going to magnify all the way down this stem. And the likelihood of this breaking right here is increased. So to me, this elongated branch, it doesn't have to be as obvious as in this photo, okay? It could be very subtle. Another thing we're going to talk about in a minute is when you have a parent stem and the competing leader is more than 50% of the parent stem. So say this is 24 inches in diameter, and then this one is 18, that is 75% of that. Once you exceed 50% or 75%, you're getting into the danger zone, because that tree is really locked and loaded. And if you look really closely here, you can see that the branch has already failed right here. There was another competing branch right here. If you look closely, right there, there was another trunk coming up, already failed. You can see all the callus wood development on the side there. So really calibrate your eye when you're looking at trees, okay? Here's another example of an elongated branch with poor taper. Okay, so very long branch with poor taper and a lion's tail at the end. This is like a Q-tip. Think of this branch, it's elongated like a bucket, it's holding a bucket of water way out at the ends, and then all the load is there in the bucket at the ends. And that elongation magnifies the load. So it's better to have some interior branches. Someone many years ago just, was a chicken, and they got in there and they just pruned. They pruned a branch here, and they pruned a branch here, and they pruned a branch here. And they just kept pruning down the line until they had nothing left but just this big poof at the end. Lion's tailing is a bad practice, and not retaining some interior branches. It's better to get out here at the ends and reduce load at the ends by doing some minor reduction pruning. Okay.
Lisa,
Yeah,
Lisa, just for a quick clarity, could you describe what poor taper is, or what proper taper is?
definitely. So taper is your typical, when a branch is attached, it may be thicker here, and then it subtly gets thinner and thinner and thinner as it gets further along. And that's more appropriate for distributional load, right? When you have poor taper, you're going to have, which could also be elongation of a branch. The load carrying capacity is diminished in this area. This is really where it's managing the load, right here at the union. And it's so narrow, it's lacking in taper. So you want to look at that if it's a very skinny branch. Now, some species have, like a pine, canary pines, very slender taper. Deodar cedars, very slender taper. So it is a species specific characteristic, but you do want to recognize it. If you say, oh yeah, that branch on that deodar, it's really skinny. It's not very well tapered, but it's not that long. It doesn't have a lot of load. So failures usually occur in combination. It's not just one thing. What if I said to you, oh my gosh, this branch is so long. And then we looked at it and we said, look how long that branch is. Oh my gosh, it's all the way down here. And then this was all the load right there. You'd be like, okay, well, not a lot of load. Doesn't look that great, but is it going to fail? Not as likely. Okay. So you have to look at the combination of defects. Okay. I'm going on a little bit on that, but kind of calibrating your mind. Okay. Here's another example. I just saw this tree on Thursday, or I guess Tuesday, and I hadn't seen it in a while. And this branch is really long. You can't see, but it goes even further. And if you look closely, it's all rotted on the top, but we have it cable back. You can't see it, but we have it cable back. So the funny thing is that we recognize that we can just prune at the ends, prune first, cable second. Always attempt to achieve your goals by pruning. If you can't manage the load solely by end weight pruning, then you might resort to some other structural stability methods, a brace, a cable, a guy wire, TBD, right? But just always try to use pruning as your first line of defense. Okay, bark inclusion. Now this is perfect example. You have the parent stem here on the right, and then this competing leader came out on the left. And now this bark inclusion is a weak point. The challenge is that this one on the right could just get heavy enough and just fail because it is not attached. This is not attached. This is actually, they're pushing up against each other. One is growing and the other is growing and they're pushing. And this seam will continue to get higher and higher up. Eventually, this one probably on the right will fail. That bark inclusion is a problem. Now, sometimes you'll have like a Bradford pear. They're notorious for bark inclusions. So knowing that you have that defect, what if I told you this was 30 feet long? if I said that's 30 feet longer? What if I told you it was 5 feet longer? So see, bark inclusion, not great, but 5 feet of load, I'm not so worried. 30 feet of load, now I need to bring that tree back in, okay? So these are strategies that you can employ. And these strategies are important when we're having these heavy wind events. Reducing load, reducing end weight, reducing crown. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, okay? So let's move on. But that bark inclusion is definitely a ticking time bomb. So earlier I mentioned to you when the parent stem, it has a competing leader, and eventually that starts to become the same size or close to it. So when you have this parent stem that was coming up here, and then this branch came off, and it might have been going toward the light, and it got almost the same diameter as its parent stem. This union is poorly attached. And not to get into too much of the body language of trees, but as a branch is growing, the parent stem is wrapping wood all the way around. It's wrapping wood every year. As the tree's parent stem is developing tree rings, it's wrapping around. And when you have a branch that's competing in size, it only wraps around on the sides, It's not wrapping on the top. So then that whole top where it's anchored, that tension side can break. And especially if this becomes too elongated, if this is a really long branch, lots of load, this weak attachment becomes compromised. So look for branches that are competing and look at load reduction strategies, okay? So you're really calibrating your eyes here. Okay, so here's another example. This magnolia had a bunch of branches that were all the same size as the trunk. You can see this one that failed and broke out was competing. Another thing that I see oftentimes on some tree species, and magnolias included, is a congested branching attachment. All the branches are all within a small area. And if you look here, you can see that they started pruning some of them out. They had this one and this one and this one and this one and this one, maybe another one on the backside, all jamming into this little space here. And they're all competing for that wood fiber to lock them in. So eventually that poor branch attachment can allow, and this might have also been a bark inclusion, and that bark inclusion, as I mentioned earlier, is not attached. So water can collect in there. And what happens? You get rot developing, and then you get a branch failure. So look for these defects. You still have this branch that's elongated coming all the way out. So how would we manage that? Reduce some of the load, reduce some of the leaf matter at the ends. Here's another example of a congested branching and poor aspect ratio. And you can see also species failure profile, the red iron bark, notorious for shedding branches. And so this particular branch fell. It was a rainy day, but the trees, evergreen, eucalyptus are evergreen, pines typically are evergreen. They're going to be heavily loaded when we have rains and winds, right? They're not like a sycamore where the winds and rains can blow through, or any deciduous species. So these defects in combination with other load problems can increase the likelihood of failure, okay? And then we have a codominant structure. It's actually a multi-stem, and this again can be a point of failure. So look at multi-stems. You see that with like melaleuca and olive and camphor trees and trees that are grown as multis oftentimes, okay? So let's see, there's some chats here. There's a couple questions. I'm glad. Selena's gonna be getting pumped for the exam.
Yeah, Jamie asked, are parent stems something that happen with standard fruit trees or multi-trunk too?
Well, I see right here that it is multi as well now. Yeah.
So a parent stem is usually the main parent stem. Now you could have 3 multis that are all parent stems. So to answer your question, Jamie, yeah. And that's a challenge though. And structurally, it will be a compromise situation as it gets heavier and heavier and there's more load above that defect. So I always say defect, load, defect, load, defect, defect, load. So you're looking at it from that caliber. Is that picture is from the big oak outside of Griffith Park? I don't think so. I don't think so. Which oak? I'm trying to think. No, these oaks, no, it's a private location. These are all my photos. So, and okay, here's a park. This oak codominant. And it's hard to see, but there is a bark inclusion going on here, major bark inclusion. And it's right down the middle. So you can see there's like some leaves in here, but there's a seam. And if you look really closely, you can see the seam all the way down. Then look at what happens what happens is that the tree is bulging, like this whole area is bulging. And this bulging, you can't see it from this angle, but this bulging is response growth. The tree's putting on extra wood saying, oh my gosh, I'm like totally getting pressure from these two. So what happens if you look at it from the other side is, oops, hold on. I gotta close my, whoop, there's your elephant ears. That's the same tree. Isn't that nuts? Let's go back. You're looking at going, whoa, codom, look at that, amazing. Not to mention the trunk is completely buried. There's no trunk flare. And then you see it from this angle and you go, wow, this is all response growth on the sides. The tree is putting on your Notre Dame flying buttresses. It's like, I better put on extra wood because I'm literally going to flip out this way. And as the tree gets further and further and further apart and more load reaching up to the sky, it's just going to keep putting on extra wood. Trees are optimizers. Trees put wood where they need it. They are reacting to what? Gravity. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Carlos got it. So we're reacting to gravity. They're reacting to gravity. And they're like, I got to hold this load together. So they put on extra wood. Isn't that amazing? So when you see a bulge or you see a tree with a branch, that's like lots of wood here on the tension side and lots of wood on the compression side, that's the tree responding to gravity. That static loading from the leaves is increasing the wood tapering, right? So that's why I said earlier, if you don't see tapering, the tree has never responded to its load. That's concerning, right? Okay. So I love these photos. They're so fun. So then here's another, I think I had a duplicate of that in there. Yeah, it's just a duplicate. Okay, so another thing we're looking for, dead bark. Like this is a deodar cedar, completely dead on one whole side. Now, what if no one had gone down there like I did? I walked down to this tree, I go, let's walk down this big long slope. We walked down. I said, look, you have, this is all rotted, all decayed. Even the roots at the base are decayed. I'm concerned. So that was a removal candidate. We just didn't want it to fall over the fence and land in the neighbors. Okay, here is another defect, buried trunks and encircling roots and girdling roots. Now the difference between stem girdling roots and encircling roots is that stem girdling roots are girdling the main stem. So if they're touching the base of the trunk and they're wrapping around, they're an SGR. If they're out here, even a few inches away, they're encircling roots. Stem girdling roots are the leading cause of whole tree failure all the time. I have so many cases. I do a lot of legal work. And this tree, I'd seen it was an Aleppo pine. And I went out there and you couldn't even see any of these roots going around. It was like all the dirt was covering it. And so the dirt was covering it all the way up. And it's hard to see it, but it was like this. The dirt was coming around and I saw a little bit of it, but I said, could you blow this out for me? And they did it all by hand. I came back like a week later and lo and behold. So what do? Can we just get in there and nip away at some of the roots? Yeah, we could do that. It depends. Maybe we get a chisel and we cut here, and cut here, try to notch this puppy out. This to me is going to be a problem child. I mean, where else is this tree going to go? Or just take the tree out. Tick tock, tick tock. I have cases. I have another whole presentation I could give where I had a tree, a Chinese elm, and it was in a planter. And it was literally a sausage at the end. And roots had been going round and round and round for 25 years, because we know when the tree was planted. And it just went boop. And the whole bowl of roots going round and round was still in the ground. It was crazy. So underground, the root architecture can dictate pathogen potential, root health, root architecture, and the canopy's health, right? So if you see something, a flattened section, like what kind of drew my eye was that I could see that this was going in. It's hard to tell from the photo. Yeah, say that again. Oh, somebody's off mute.
I gotcha.
Okay. Yeah, so I could see that you had an inverted trunk here. It's very subtle, but if you don't see a nice flare, that should make you go, So you want to see some nice flare coming off. You want to see a flare. Like these are the start of flares, but this is not adequate. Okay, this tree was getting too big for that. So Pamela's asking, what causes girdling? Good question, Pamela. Oftentimes nursery containers, they don't move them up fast enough and they can get encircled. Also, people, when they're buying their trees, they're not pulling the soil away to look like, they put it in the ground and we're off to the races. And 5-10 years later, we get this. So it's important when you are purchasing and planting, you're pulling away that soil. And just yesterday, I was on a project, beautiful estate, and I started pulling away at the base of this collection of trees that they're going to plant. And they're little guys. And the master gardener was like, oh, yeah. And we're like, yeah, pull away. And we were laughing. We're like, should we just leave them? Should we just let them plant them with these little baby roots and just let these trees go south in 5 to 10 years? And we're laughing and we're going like, oh, thank goodness they have us, we're like, we have to pat ourselves on the back because nobody else will. So
but we're going to take a small group up to Devil Mountain Nursery in a couple weeks to see how David grows his trees in Pioneer pots, because it is night and day.
Oh my gosh. So to that effect, as Sean's describing, and all my students know because we go up there every year, is that when you grow trees and anything in a pot that has the ability to self prune and air prune and then move up faster, so that the roots can never get into a position where they're encircled in the box and going round and round, then you're going to have a successful root architecture. You want to encourage that natural rooting that a native or natural tree does in the field. Okay. So these are defects you want to look for. Here's SGR here, leading cause of root plate failure, bound feet. When there's wind events and that energy is distributing down to the roots and the root goes book, and just pops right over, right at that union. And if you look really closely, I won't get into lawsuits, but there's a lot of them that I've seen. If you looked at this closely, you can see this indentation right here, where this root was actually right in there. This root right there was actually wrapped around. So see, we could have seen this. This was above grade. Okay. Oh my gosh, I have so many more slides and we got to go faster. Okay, saturated soil plate. We saw a lot of that. Roots need friction. Roots need friction in the soil. So when there's too much turf water and then you add rainwater, it's like a boggy soup. So saturated soils, all bets are off. Now, obviously, smaller trees, less load, less exposure. It's not just the saturated soil. It could also be, it was slightly leaning. It's evergreen. It got wind, yada, yada. So if you're familiar with it in Brentwood, they have Torrey pines. And so there was a huge Torrey pine that fell into my client's property, 120-foot Torrey pine. I have photos of me standing under the root plate. The trunk was 6 feet across. This tree was massive and the whole root plate went over. And I have photos of encircling roots around the whole root plate. Saturated soil, encircling roots, girdling roots, elevated canopy, evergreen, check down the list. Okay. Here was another case. I saw cracking soil. root plate failure. So this tree was actively failing. It actually started to fail and it stopped in another pine tree. And no one else had picked it up. It had several people out. So I was glad I caught that because there was a utility line that it would have landed on with a transformer. Wouldn't have been good. So other things that you can look for: oak root fungus at the base, rocks and gravel, crush the soil, encourage anaerobic soil, perfect breeding ground for these soil-borne root rot pathogens. Oak root fungus, Phytophthora, they all love anaerobic soils. And when you don't have mulch in that critical root zone, you're going to increase the likelihood of these pathogens having, remember that disease triangle. You've got the host, you've got the disease, and now we've created the perfect environment. We've got rocks holding the moisture, crushing the soil, cutting off the flow of oxygen. On the one on the left, we've got concrete, we've got turf, chronic irrigation. They probably used a weed whacker around the tree every week. So all of these adding up. Now, this is what I was talking about with the bleeding canker. Okay, so this is Phytophthora. If you saw a lot of this summer, chronic Phytophthora brought on by poor soil conditions. Now, you can deep soak, you can use some products to suppress, but remember, get the patient healthy so that it can fight it. And the best way to do that is to improve root health. All of these bleeding cankers are only a result and a reflection of root health or stress. Here's sulfur fungus. Now, remember, this is a brown rot. This is a carob over here, and this is a carob over there. There's different sulfur fungus, but you'll see a lot of them at the end of summer through the fall. Then we have Ganoderma. The Ganoderma, to me, this one looks like it's taking advantage of this dead section of the tree. There's Ganoderma applanatum, which is the artist conch. Kind of looks like a shelf, like a bracket. And then we have Ganoderma lucidum, which is a little more blobby in the root plate. And that actually is the more dangerous of the two, the lucidum. So sometimes they're wood rotting pathogens that eating old wood, yes. And here's buried trunks. So this is one of my pet peeves, buried trunks, because remember, the trunk root interface is the leading cause of pathogen entry into a tree. Okay, that dynamic area, lenticels are exchanging gases. That compromises, pathogens can get in. Here's another example of a buried trunk on this poor oak, and you can also see bleeding cankers. So Phytophthora can take advantage of stressed trees, hard soil, compact soil, lack of deep soaking, buried trunk. You just put them all together. Here's another buried trunk right here on this beautiful valley oak. You can see. Michelle's asking how far away should rocks be from a tree? Well, I just always jokingly say, how would you like to have a bag of rocks on your chest every night while you're sleeping? But I know that's overly dramatic, so I won't use that analogy. But but you know, rocks crush soil. So I always say, do a ribbon, do it at the outer edges, make it a thin layer. Don't use big boulder rocks unless you're like a few decorative, you know. Think critically. If you have a patient that's old and it's in decline, don't put it into the ICU. Don't stress it out. If you have an old tree, you want optimal conditions. You want beautiful mulch. You want proper deep soaking occasionally. If you have an old tree, you got to treat it like an old person, right? So I just gave a talk last week for the Golf Course Superintendents Association. I used this photo from the Masters. So if anyone's a golf fan here, this is what happened, is that 3 enormous pine trees came down, one, and then it took out a couple too. And if you look closely, you can see buried trunk and poor live crown ratio, meaning that all these trees are skirted up so that everybody can see across the Masters and can see, and then you see this beautiful canopy. So all the trees are stunning and they're beautiful, but they're all like these big, tall Q-tips. And I know you all are asking right now, how would I know that all these trees are beautiful? Well, I did go to the Masters last year. So that was my humble brag when I was talking to the golf course guys. And let me tell you, those trees are spectacular, but buried trunks can lead to, because think of it, roots are anchoring like this. Now, when the trunk is buried, now the roots are down here and they're encouraged to grow up. Now, how can you anchor yourself if your roots are encouraged to start growing this direction, right? Roots want to be anchored like this. So makes sense, right? They did have extraordinarily heavy rain and winds. So that added to it, as you can see. But look at, that's the critical root zone. That was the whole root plate that came up on an 80-foot tall tree, maybe 90, 100 feet. If you look at the videos. Here's another client of mine. They had this beautiful valley oak and they were dropping limbs and they called me to come inspect it. I was like, this tree is buried. And they're like, no, we protect the tree. And I'm like, well, for one, they built a whole driveway motor court around this poor valley oak. It's a huge tree. So I had them blow it out and look at what we have. That whole dark brown area is buried. That is the proper flare. That should be above grade. If you look really closely, you start to see the beginnings of fungal activity trying to get into the tree. This tree could be rotted inside. We don't know. This tree could have a completely compromised root plate and it could totally fall over without warning. But for sure, from that to that is a huge improvement. Okay. Here's another example I like to use: before, after, in between. What happens, as I said, when the tree is buried, it grows roots up into this upper profile, into the mulch. And you get these little tiny fibrous roots that are coming up looking for the oxygen. The tree's like, oh my gosh. And these are what we call adventitious roots. They're taking advantage. They're growing up into that profile where the oxygen is available. And unfortunately, then they start to grow round and round and round the tree. So you want to protect that flare. Okay. That's the same photo I showed you guys earlier. Okay. So failure profiles. If you want to learn more about the failure profiles, the Western Arborist magazine, as part of our Western chapter of ISA, has, through the Britton Fund, BRITTON, created a series of structural failure profiles of 5 species: valley oak, Monterey pine, blue gum, coast live oak, and also I think Monterey cypress. So you can look at these, you can go on the Britton Fund website and you can pull these out and read through them. And they show great photos and data and statistics on how they fail, when they fail, what sizes they typically are. Okay. So get to know those species, So we know we have these defects. And now what are we going to do with these defects? We want to look at defect and load, defect and load. What is the risk potential? So we're going to ask ourselves these questions. Where is the defect? And how much load is it supporting? Is the defect in a branch? Is it in the trunk? Or is it in the root plate? And we want to think of what load the tree is carrying. Static load is the density of the canopy foliage. Static, meaning it's always there. And lever arm, this is another term you want to think about, is the length or height of a tree or a branch. And the greater the distance of the lever arm and the greater the distance of the foliage, the greater the distance of the center of force. So like if you had a Q-tip and a line tail, that center of force would be way out in the middle of that foliage. And the longer the lever arm, the greater the magnification of wind and force. So if you have a tall tree like that one at the Masters, very tall tree like a Q-tip. So when wind was hitting it up here in the center of the force, it was magnifying down that tree and popped it out of the ground. That's how much magnification occurred. So how do you deal with that? Reduce the end weight. You can reduce the load. Okay, load management, pruning can reduce risk and mitigate defects. So how does that look? And I'm sure I created this handout on the left. The diagram on the right, the before and after, are from Dr. Ed Gilman, preeminent expert in pruning. He wrote the book on pruning, and he's phenomenal. I made this little diagram of crown reduction, and it's just talking about, I wanted people to have an idea, like, what does that look like when you say you're going to crown reduce my tree? And I'll say, this is a little example. You might crown reduce for, bring the tree in for wind load, reduce it for, clearance from a building, for an elongated branch, you might just do one branch that's elongated, or reduce a portion of the canopy to minimize risk. So this is a great example of strategic pruning for load. And here's from Ed Gilman's same diagram before and after. So you're taking the longer stem and you're cutting it back into an interior lateral. So you're taking this and you're cutting it back to right here. See that over here on the right? You're taking this long one and you're taking that out. So you're taking that out over here. You're cutting it. So now you're going to have this smaller, nicely smaller tree or smaller branch. And that reduction pruning, also the beauty of reduction pruning is that you can prune at the outer edges and the tree will not respond and grow back as fast. And you ask yourself, well, why? How is that possible? The reason is that the roots are the hormones. The roots are controlling the leaves. Remember, I said earlier, root happiness is a reflection of canopy happiness. And that's a fast and easy way of saying just protect the roots and the canopy will be happy. But if you're pruning at the outer edges, you're making smaller cuts. If you're pruning at the outer edges, it's the furthest point away from the roots. The roots will not sense all of that outer edge canopy reduction as much. What if you did the opposite and you gutted the interior and you just took all the interior branching and all that interior foliage is gone and you just left all these poofs at the end? Well, now the roots have to really work. They're like, oh my gosh, I photosynthesize out here and I got to go all the way back down to the roots. So that stimulates a chemical reaction. The roots are in charge. They're the hormones. And they say, okay, everybody grow back. And you see those trees that every single branch has water sprouts growing on them. Even the trunk may have furry water sprouts. And roots will swing the pendulum and they'll overcompensate. So that interior gutting of foliage is actually just doing nothing other than overstimulating the tree to grow back faster. That's why when you focus on end weight, you can achieve so many goals: reducing risk, reducing load, keeping it at a dedicated size. You're pruning for so many goals and you're minimizing the roots response. Okay, so I could go on and on about it. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about crown reduction pruning strategies. So we could talk about that in another class, but here's my close-up. And pruning to reduce risk of failure during wind load. Wind. So now think about wind, velocity of wind. The higher up you go in the tree, the faster it is, the greater the velocity. And the word load, remember I told you, is the density of the canopy foliage. But you can also have wind load. That's a dynamic loading. And we talked about lever arm. The length or height of a branch of a tree pushes the center of force or load further out, and the force of the wind magnifies. So let's see some videos to show this. Dr. Ed Gilman's videos. This is not prune. These. Okay, now this tree is thinned out. They just thinned it out, just took out some branches in the center, thinned it out. Okay, we got the message on that one. Now we reduced the tree blowing in the wind. This center one is the one we're focused on, okay? They reduced it by 30. It's very subtle to see, but you can see that the tree that was thin, it was not as impactful. The wind was still impacting the entire, it was not as successful or beneficial. The reduction pruning is you're reducing the load. You're reducing the load on the top of the tree and the elongation of the branches. So ISA pruning guidelines say that you should impact the tree as little as you can. and that mature trees should receive little routine pruning and focus on risk mitigation, load management. People say, oh my gosh, I'm going to prune the tree. Why? What is your goal? What is your objective? Well, I'm worried about a branch failure. Okay, if you're worried about that, let's prune for that section. Let's prune a little here. Don't thin out the whole tree just because it's been 3 years. Pruning should have a goal or objective, okay? It can be limited to removal of dead branches, reduction pruning, removal of an entire limb if it's dangerous. And as I always say, I kind of coined this phrase, veteran tree management is load management, because that's how older trees often can fail, is due to load management. Young trees should receive structural pruning. You want to enhance their future growth, maintain that apical dominance, get nice scaffolding branch aspect ratio. If you see a wild hair going off, competing, eventually going to be a codon, subordinate that, bring it back in, make it shorter, right? And if you think about that, when you're pruning leaves, and leaves are light catchers. And when you're removing light catchers, then that's going to stunt that branch, right? So if you have a branch and you have the apical dominance of the parent stem and you have one coming out, a wild hair, and you tip it back and do a nice little reduction pruning, you're reducing the amount of light catchers. So there's less photosynthetic material for that stem, less sugars and starches and carbs, so less expansion of that trunk. So now you're letting this one catch up and surpassing it, and you're subordinating and keeping that within under 50%. Okay, remember, the older and larger a tree becomes, the less energy it has. So the bigger the cut on an older tree, the longer it will take to compartmentalize and defend against decay or insects. Okay, don't overthin trees. Okay, we know that. Here's an example of overthinning. The tree just grew back like bonkers the following year, and just like a furry cousin it, because it had been so overly thinned. And everybody thought this looked great. Everyone thought, oh my gosh, look at how beautiful, and da-da-da, and look, we got more sunlight on the turf. I thought, well, it's, as my friend Ed Gilman says, the only thing that happened was an exchange of money, meaning that within a year, this tree's going to be back to where it was again. I love that. I've used it for many a year. So this would be my goal. Get out to the ends, focus on tipping, nice reduction cuts. Now, obviously this dashed line is not what you would do, just draw a bowl over it. You want to be natural in your approach, natural or target pruning. Okay. So we talked about salt toxicity. I'm going to run through that a little bit. This obviously is an oak with bleeding cankers. And we talked about ways that we can reduce salt toxicity, which is essentially deep soaking, okay? Ways that you can deep soak, okay? And then this is my deep soaking installation. You can just, it doesn't need to be complicated. You just need to put down a good soaker hose, good coverage, and let it rip for 1 day a month. And how long? TBD. What's the soil like? What's the species? How much open soil is there? You know, how old is the tree? You get to dictate that. Sometimes people will let their hose run for a whole day and, oh my gosh, I forgot, I didn't turn it off for a day. I'm like, it was just like a lovely summer rain. Don't worry about it. Just wait another month and get a probe, check the soil, and see how it looks. Okay. So let's talk about climate change and species selection. No, we're already at 8:09. Oh my gosh. Okay. So this is info coming out hot off the presses from Dr. Matt Ritter and his team up at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and Cami Pollock at the Biological Sciences Department. And they shared this website. So I'm pulling this info from them because I feel it's very important that we understand. So you can go to this website that they have, I can give it out later, and they talk about trees. What are trees? They did this study. They got 2 major tree companies that do all the cities, like pretty much all the cities in the state of California. They got an inventory of 7 million street trees, and they did all the data. What are they? Here's some of the data. This is the list of trees that are native to LA. There are 15 species, which is a higher number than most California cities. We have Acer macrophyllum, and I apologize, this is not written with a italicized. I'm so mortified. Let me italicize that right now. Okay, there. Acer macrophyllum, Acer negundo, box elder, Alnus rhombifolia, our lovely alder, Juglans californica, our black walnut, Platanus racemosa, the sycamore, Populus fremontii, Populus trichocarpa, Pseudotsuga macrocarpa, our good old fashioned coast live oak, Quercus chrysolepis, Quercus lobata, Quercus wislinii, Salix levigata, Salix lasiandra, Umbellularia californica, a lovely California bay. There you go. That's our 15 native trees here in LA, okay? So you'll notice many of those species are high water usage. Only 7 are native to LA, have medium or low, okay? These are the rankings from selecttree.org. If you want to go to that, it's great. Okay. Sorry, that's a repeat. Within the city of LA, many species are native only to particular areas like the California Bay, like the Palisades. Others are just focused on other areas. Yeah, select tree, thanks. And you need to think about, not everything grows everywhere. Like black walnut, it's on the north side of Mulholland, the Mulholland Canyon. And so using this data, 13 of the 15 species are currently planted in the LA forest. There are over 409 species of trees in the urban forest, okay? That of the 326,000 trees planted in LA as street trees, 5,700 are native. This means that most of our city's current urban forest is non-native. You got that? Which is okay. Let's not be snobs about this, right? Okay, so here's a breakdown of genus. We have Quercus, Platanus, Pinus. These are not native. Lagerstromia, or crepe myrtle, Eucalyptus, Australia, Iris, Washingtonia, Mexican fan palm, that's not from California. Magnolia, liquid amber, Syagris, our queen palms. Look at that. Look at that. Here's this water rating. A lot of our trees are medium or high. Only 21% are low water rating. Okay, here's a list of California's native trees. If you look at this, this is Southern California, up the close-up right here on the left. If it's blue, it only has 1 native tree in that whole area. If it's yellow, or yeah, if it's yellow, it might have maybe 5 to 10. Okay. So moving on. Sometimes
Lisa, real quick, I think I spelt the website wrong. What is the proper website spelling for
it's
select tree?
I think you had it. Let me type it in there. Let me see. Let's see if I can type.
And it didn't work for me.
Or you, I think you got to put in the www.
Oh,
There you go. Okay, so think about these statistics though. Don't get them misinterpreted as a great opportunity to plant more native trees. We don't have enough native tree diversity. We have to pull from non-natives that are climate adapted, okay? So, thanks, Sean. So it's important that you think about that. Planting only natives will lead to lower overall diversity. And a lot of these trees are not, they're challenging street trees, okay? We cannot rely solely on native trees to build an urban canopy. We must look to a climate adapted. And this was not on the website, but I saw Matt speak about 1.5 years ago. And I took a photo of this slide. I thought this was brilliant. He took all of those 7 million trees and he broken them down by where that tree is from and California. So compared to California. So for example, here on the left, 54% of the trees in their native range, it's colder and wetter. Okay. 26% of our trees that we have here in their native range, similar to California. Those probably are eucalyptus, acacias, species from South Africa, Australia. Then we have 16.5% from warmer and wetter. He said what we need to be selecting from is the blue, warmer than California and drier than California. This is the take-home message right here. 1.5% of all of the trees here in California come from a native range that is warmer than us and drier than us. We need to start pulling from that. Okay. So what does that mean? What are we going to select? You know, I jokingly say, well, California, how about Arizona, Nevada, Mexico? I don't know, but plants don't seem to know the state lines. They don't go, oh, I'm a native California. Well, I'm a native Arizona tree. No, they're like, I'm just here, right? So let's not be snobs. Okay.
Lisa, real quick, how do you feel about the climate ready trees study with UC Davis?
I think these are great and I have it in here.
Okay, cool. I'll put that in the chat too.
Yeah. So we'll talk quickly about effects of heat. We know all the things that happen with heat. Okay. Scorching, sunburn, leaves falling off, shoot and root growth inhibition, disturbs water relations, all these things. Okay. And also if you add salt to it, that salt gets pulled up into the leaves, which also impacts. Talk about transpiration, leaf burn, stress. Now, root disease can be minimized by maintaining mulch-covered, turf-free circles around the trunks. And my esteemed colleague, Dr. Linda Chalker-Scott, she did this study of mulch, no mulch, shade, sun, turf. And I'll give you the highlights. The areas that have mulch, the whole goal of this study was to study the fluctuations of temperatures of soil in different scenarios. Bare mound in the sun, bare soil in the sun, bare soil in the shade, turf in the shade, sun, mulch. Places that didn't have any mulch, the fluctuations in the daytime, hot, cold, cold at night. Hot, cold, cold at night. So she showed from a research standpoint that the elevations and fluctuations are detrimental and stressful to the roots. So you got to protect these roots. So putting down that layer, that blanket of mulch, regulates the soil temperature, stays cool in the day, stays warm at night. Okay, makes total sense. But this proves it. This shows that mulch is your friend. Also, mulch has other benefits, and we'll talk about that. So she showed in this study, which she called to mulch or not to mulch. It shouldn't even be a question. And you can go to her website, gardenprofessors.com, and she shows this study and how you regulate soil temperatures, and then why you want to protect soil temperatures from the most extreme. And remember, in the middle of the summer, when your leaves are transpiring and moisture is pulling out of the leaves, if the roots are happy and the roots are healthy and they're pulling up water and they've got good mycorrhizae and they're protected and they're pulling up nutrients, those leaves in the canopy are going to manage those extremes. Okay. So these are really, really important to think about. So examples of mulch: wide, not deep. Don't touch the trunk. Remember, grass is competitive, and that grass reduces exchange of oxygen. Another example, it holds in the moisture, regulates soil temps, inhibits weeds, prevents soil erosion, maintains soil nutrients as it breaks down. And here's kind of a white paper on her study, okay? And also, you know, as mulch is breaking down, all the studies are showing, like Dr. Linda Chalker-Scott and Dr. Jim Downer, is that the mulch is actually like a good probiotic for the soil and actually gets into the soil, breaks down, and encourages good beneficial microbes and insects. And that by doing that, you're suppressing and you're pushing away and inhibiting or fostering any type of scenario or soil condition that will allow pathogens to take hold. Remember that disease triangle. So mulch is the good environment. You can have ochre fungus from your neighbor. It's not going to come over to your place because you have mulch laid down. You're fostering healthy roots. Okay. So like to the point that you mentioned about UC Davis, Dr. McBride and Igor LaShawn at Berkeley, Think about your species. Are they going to tolerate the soil moisture, soil texture, sunlight? Do they handle drought, wind, salt, cold? And this vulnerability matrix is good to study. And then there's also a pest vulnerability matrix. Get to know the pests and pathogens that impact trees and emerging pests. You know, we have the golden spotted oak borer coming up from Mexico and Southern California. This golden spotted oak borer is a problem. And we've had polyphagous shothole borer, which is now the invasive shothole borer, and that whole complex. So getting to know these emerging pests. You might also think about low biogenic emissions, low root damage potential. That's always on my mind. Longevity. I'd like to get a tree that lasts longer than 20 years, which is the average for an urban tree. Carbon storage, aesthetics, low leaf, low tree litter, shade. So think of these other characteristics that you might choose from. These are species that are going away. Redwood, plum, London plane, Monterey pine, Victorian box, sweet gum. They don't like extremes. And they're already showing issues. Botrisphaera canker on redwoods and Victorian box and sweet gum. London plane, lots of issues. Purple leaf plum, they get attacked. And Monterey pine, they're from Monterey. Leave them up in Monterey, okay? So we have salt tolerant species from their list, oaks, she oaks. Now they have London plane. Again, I'm not a big fan of London plane. And then they have it as moderate, and then low redwood, sweet gums. They don't like high salt. Water stress. So we have this list. I'm kind of racing through this, you guys. Here are some of the species that they talk about, possible species from Australia, Asia, the Mediterranean basin, Southwest, others from Southern California, Mexico, South America. And then we have Southern California underutilized species from Dr. Matt Ritter. And this is a great list, okay? How do we modify our landscapes to mimic nature? Phase out high water use, salt sensitive trees, capture and store more water, reuse the water, maximize soil water reservoir, adopt oasis, decrease planting density. Why do we have to be so congested? Maybe one gorgeous tree, and increase mulched areas. Here's a list you can get from Devil Mountain, and they have a fabulous list of species that they're growing, which meet all these criteria, okay? Climate adapted, some are native, some are not. All in all, they're going to be trees for the future, okay? How do we improve our trees' abilities to tolerate extreme drought and extreme heat? Ensure they're hydrated occasionally, best before the heat, and put that mulch down. Regulate the soil temperature. That is the best way you can improve our trees' abilities to tolerate all these extremes. So we covered a lot. Oh my gosh, it's a lot of info there. And I appreciate all of you hanging in there as long as you could. And I'm looking at some questions. Lucia, thank you. Any recommended trees for natives good for pots? Oh my gosh. Well, I call a pot a bouquet of flowers that just enjoy it. Michael McDermott, hey, how often do I need to change mulch? Diana, thank you. Nice to see you here. Thank you so much. Well, mulch, you could change it out to mulchuous. I love that. How often do you need to change mulch? It depends. It's, it could be every couple of years or every year. You can, let it go. You can add to it. Just make sure that you're not burying the trunk. Okay. You want to make sure you're not burying the trunk because that is a chronic problem. I see the mulch volcano erupting over a series of years.
I gotta say, Lisa, that I get my little 6-year-old out there with his pruners and his gloves, and we chop and drop everything. All of the shrub clippings, old sunflowers, everything goes back in the soil. And it may not be the prettiest mulch, but I tell you what, all of those seedlings are sprouting like crazy. So I'm making my own mulch. Nothing leaves in the green bin unless it goes to a hugelkultur workshop. So, yeah. I mean, what if we took care of our green waste on site and made our own mulch?
Yeah.
That would be a paradigm shift.
Right. And also because, mulch still has the nutrients in it. It still has the nitrogen. It hasn't broken down. And that breaking down process that you're encouraging is so phenomenal. It's really fostering that soil to have good microbiomes. And Carol asked about tree stakes. Oh my God, I could do another presentation on tree stakes. Trees don't grow with stakes on them. They grow like that in a nursery. Immediately upon installation, take the stake off. And thanks, Erin. Nice to see you. Take the stakes off immediately. And you want to see, in fact, I'll show you the coolest photo you're going to ever see. And it's the coolest thing. And oh, I gotta find it. I have this staking handout that I want to show you, that essentially you want to free the tree, because the tree wants to be moving gently. And the more it moves gently, the more it's going to develop its own root system. It's going to take off faster. And these are, thank you, Carol, if you know my pet peeve, consequences of improper staking: trunk taper will not develop. Lodge poles become stuck and they can't remove. Roots may dry up if staking holes are not backfilled. Tight stakes girdle the trunk. We see that all the time. Restrict the uptake of nutrients, inhibit a tree's elevation. They allow the tree to lean. If you get a little wind, then the tree goes, okay, now we grow roots this way. And the stake is still attached. What is a stake meant to do? Hold it up, get it out of the root ball, right? So I'll show you an example. I had this client and she had a tree, and she had, well, I kind of let you go. No, I came out to the house, the tree on the left, I unstaked. The tree on the right, I left it staked. And I told her, don't forget to take the stake off. And so I came back 3 years later, and these were the trees, the unstaked tree and the stake tree. I rest my case. Carol, you opened a Chris hug. Thanks, Selena. Thank you also all for your kind thoughts. And there's just so much to cover, and I apologize if I jumped around a bit, but there's just so much to cover, and I want to jam in as much as possible. But as you can see, the proper staking is to the sides. Just like a child, don't have learned helplessness. Don't hold on to the baby tree forever. You gotta put the stakes to the side, let the tree move, because trees are adaptive. They respond to movement. And if they feel themselves moving, they go, oh, everybody grow a root. Everybody establish the roots. Okay, now we can grow. So trees respond when they are freed. Okay.
Lisa,
Yeah.
I always get so energized every time I'm with you or around you, and every time you speak, and the way you move your body to demonstrate your points makes me think we should do a stage performance of interpretive dance: trees, soil, food web, fungi,
Oh, yeah.
humans. It would be so cool. And how could we demonstrate through interpretive dance how we are so wrong with trees?
We're gonna do spinning for like girdling roots or something like that. Then we'll fall down, you know.
I have a question about reclaimed or gray water on trees. Since salts are such an issue, do you have an opinion around gray water on trees?
Well, you got to think about that. Know thy species. Thanks, Ignacio. Nice to see you here. Gray water is, recycled water. There's different grades. And so if you have a gray water that's going to be high salinity, you want to recognize that you may be causing a pH imbalance, and that you might actually reduce the uptake of certain, in fact, Dr. Nelda Matheny is writing a book on recycled water and all the different grades. And she gave a great presentation like 6-7 years ago. I'm waiting for the book, but you really need to know what the salt levels are. You could cause a lot of problems, cause major chlorosis, interveinal chlorosis on the foliage. Some species that are highly sensitive to salts will show that more, and others may be more tolerant, those species that can handle salt. So it's TBD. You need to really analyze each situation carefully.
Yeah. And the sulfur fungus, chicken of the woods. Have you tried it? Have you eaten it?
I'm going to pass. Although I see it quite often because I'm dealing with a lot of failures, and so there's a great study that the city of Santa Monica did on eucalyptus and carob trees. And if you want to read about brown rots, sulfur fungus, is that the ukes that showed sulfur fungus conchs and the carobs that showed sulfur fungus conchs were removed. And they dissected them, tore them apart, and looked at them to see how much decay that heartwood, remember, it's a heartwood rotter. So it's eating the inside. When you see a carob that drops a branch and you see inside and you go, oh my gosh, it's totally rotted. Valley oak, notorious for sulfur fungus. So those species that get it, the city of Santa Monica studied them, and they wanted to be able to draw some conclusions on how many years had that sulfur fungus been eating. And by the time a conch comes out and you see that fruiting body, the internal heartwood had been eating away for 10 years or more. And they could draw those conclusions by the tree rings and number of rings that had been decayed. And it's a brown rot, so it only eats, what it leaves behind is the blocky, chalky lignin. It takes away the cellulose, which is the white. That's why it's called a brown rot, because it leaves the brown lignin, as opposed to a white rot like oakwood fungus. So the brown rots are inside and they're blocky, chalky, and they leave this blocky, chalky wood. So when you don't even need a wind, they'll just fall over or break a stem. So read those articles, they're great. And they give you some intel on how to look at eucalyptus and carobs and other species like pine that get sulfur fungus, latiparus. So anyway, I could go on about that.
Yeah, Lisa, it's 8:30, everybody. Thank you so much, Lisa. You rock. Could you unshare your screen for a second?
I sure can. I just wanted you to look at that staking one more time. Next time you think leaving a stake on, take it off immediately.
Take it off. Yeah. So if just get, a virtual round of applause for Lisa and her awesomeness. I just love you so much. Thank you for doing this with us. We really appreciate you. Again, I put in the chat box all of the upcoming events. If you want to follow us at Studio Petrichor, you can sign up for our newsletter. All that you need is in that chat box right now. Copy and save it. The number of workshops coming up are so exciting and more on the horizon. We just started a Hugalist certification program, and we have 2 events that are not sold out yet, and more coming, more webinars on the horizon, a garden tour this summer, planning a garden tour for September to see native gardens in their worst condition so that we can fall in love with them, even in that really hot, dry summer state. And please stay in touch with us. And well, you found us. You know how to find us. We look forward to seeing you all again soon. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.